Good day, Bermuda, and welcome to the second of two Lunch and Learns on the City of Hamilton Plan 2023 Consultative Draft with the Department of Planning's Acting Senior Planner, Kenny Campbell, and Planner, Tamden Doran. In a moment, they will begin their presentations and will then answer any questions you may have. Some questions have been submitted in advance, but you can submit
So the vision for the plan is to facilitate a vibrant and sustainable city of local and international appeal, offering a broad range of services and experiences within a pedestrian-focused and high-quality public realm. So the vision really has been the driver for the entire detailed content of the document. And as we have been devising policy concepts in preparing the document, we've constantly been testing them against the vision to ensure that there's alignment throughout the document. What we've been asking members of the public as we've been conducting consultation exercises is that if you only provide us with one piece of feedback, please make sure that that's in relation to the vision, because as I mentioned, this is what we're using to shape the entire document. So a bit of background information first. What is a city plan? Well, a land use plan in general is a document which contains a series of policies which are used in the assessment of planning applications. So it's required to contain a wide range of issues because a lot of different issues can converge in the consideration of a planning application. There is an existing city plan, and that's the City of Hamilton Plan 2015. That was issued as an operative draft plan in 2015 and adopted in 2016. So getting on for almost 8 years since that plan has been in operation. That was a clear indication to us that it was time to review that document, but not only because of the time that has passed, but also because of the evolution of the planning profession in the intervening years. It's a profession which is constantly evolving, and new and better ways of doing things are constantly being identified. So we did a lot of international research to inform our preparation of that document. And we think we've identified a couple of initiatives which would work well within the new City of Hamilton plan. So the North East Hamilton Local Plan 2022 adopted a new approach, both in terms of how a land use plan in Bermuda is prepared, but also how it is applied. And when we did consultation on that document, we received positive feedback, particularly in terms of how the plan was intended to be applied. And we listened to that feedback, and that's part of what we are now proposing within the consultative draft, which applies to the wider city area. So extensive research has gone into the preparation of the plan in order to provide transparent justification for policy direction. And all of that information is set out within the City Survey Report 2023. So we want to ensure that we have a strong evidence base for the planning direction that we have set out within the document. So there should be a clear correlation between the data that we've collected, our analysis set out within the City Survey Report, and the content of the plan itself. We will be updating the City Survey Report when we get to the draft plan stage, which is the next stage in the process, and that will contain updated data, but will also contain reference to all of the consultation comments that we receive as part of this consultation exercise, and how the department has responded to those comments, and if any changes have been made to the plan as a consequence. The final thing to say before going any further is that this is a consultation document. That's the entire purpose of this stage is in the process. And we want to hear as much feedback as possible on the ideas that we've presented within the plan. Ultimately, from this point onwards, it will be the feedback that we receive which will shape the document as it makes its way through the various processes towards adoption. So a bit on the plan making process. We've decided to adopt a 3-stage process this time around, as I briefly referenced. And the intention of that is to maximise input and provide greater scope for resolutions. So previously in Bermuda, there would be a draft plan and an adopted plan. So we wanted to introduce an earlier stage in the process in order to create an opportunity for people to provide us with feedback at an earlier stage in the process. So that's where the consultative draft comes in. And as I said, the entire purpose of it is to gather as much feedback as possible early on. So by the time we get to the draft plan stage, we could potentially have resolved a lot of the issues that come up during this earlier stage of the process. So no version of the plan will be operative until we get to the adopted stage of the process. Previously, draft plans were operative documents, but for the preparation of this plan, we want to ensure that we go through all of the comprehensive consultation exercises before we actually get to the stage of having an adopted plan in place. So just for confirmation, neither the consultative draft nor the draft plan will be utilised as operative documents. And as I said, we anticipate by the time we get to the draft plan stage that will be a more solidified representation of policy direction, having gone through this consultative draft stage, and hopefully identified and teased out a lot of the issues that people are raising and adequately addressed them and represented that updated position within the draft plan. So that by the time we get to that stage, we're looking to minimise the number of objections that we receive so that it can allow for a smoother transition towards the adopted stage of the process. But it's important to point out that the draft plan stage will be a full public consultation phase again with a minimum period of 2 months to allow for the public to provide us with feedback, and we'll provide you with details of that closer to the time. So the plan is to be read and applied in its entirety, and that may sound like an obvious statement, but it actually represents quite a significant change to how planning policy has traditionally been applied in Bermuda. What it means is when we receive a development proposal, we'll identify all of the policies within the plan which relate to that proposal, and we'll take a balanced judgment call on how the proposal sits against those policies in the round. What we're trying to move away from with this plan is those instances where there is a single policy which mandates the refusal of a planning application. We believe that a planning policy document should be fit for purpose and able to respond to a wide range of circumstances. And if a proposal is broadly acceptable in the round, then the plan should be able to recommend approval of applications in those instances. So placemaking has been adopted as the overarching theme for the document. Now, this is a broad policy concept, but in essence, what it's about is creating places with a sense of identity, sense of place, and sense of character. Now, we did a lot of international research in preparing this plan, and what we found is that there has been increased vacancy rates, particularly at the ground floor level of commercial centres throughout the world. And we were keen to understand how different jurisdictions were responding to those issues. The reasons behind those increased vacancy rates vary depending on which jurisdiction you look at, but elsewhere it can be affected by issues such as out-of-centre retailing activity. But within Bermuda, I don't think that's such an issue, and the main issue that has impacted retailing, in-person retailing in Bermuda, is the vast increase in online shopping, which has taken place over the last 20 to 25 years. So, as I said, we were keen to understand how other jurisdictions were addressing that issue. And what we found is that there seems to be this broad approach towards a renewed focus on the quality of the place. So we had a deeper look at this, and we uncovered something called placemaking, which is not an entirely new concept, but it captures a variety of issues all under a single banner. And what it's about is trying to ensure that there's focus on the quality of a place first and foremost, because if you can create places which are quality and appealing destinations to be in and of themselves, people will naturally gravitate to those areas. When that happens, they spend more time in those areas. When they spend more time, they spend more money, and existing businesses benefit from that. And also, as a consequence of that as well, we would hope that prospective businesses start to see the increased vitality in those areas and view those locations as an appealing place to establish their own business. So that cyclical process in placemaking is all about trying to support the economic growth of the city. So placemaking promotes a design-led approach to development informed by documented contextual analysis. And what that means is that when a developer comes to us, we'll be requiring them to look at the opportunities that not only their site presents, but also the surrounding area. So we'll be asking them to conduct a contextual analysis in terms of what are the prevailing building heights within the surrounding area, building widths as well. Are there any key architectural features within the surrounding area? And taking a close look at all of those issues in the round and arriving at appropriate design solutions, all under the banner of the placemaking concept. Some of the best designs in the world, most of the best designs in the world, in my opinion, are informed by high quality contextual analysis. And that's an approach which we would like to push for within the new City of Hamilton plan. So in allowing this contextual analysis to take place on an unconstrained footing, we are proposing the removal of traditional design parameters which have been applied within the city. So that's the issues such as maximum building heights and upper story setbacks. We want to ensure that there is greater freedom for architects to come up with varied and interesting designs, again, all targeted at placemaking, and removing those parameters we think would be conducive to that. Now, in removing those parameters, we want to ensure that it's not misinterpreted as complete free rein for people to come up with whatever developments that they choose and whatever building heights that they propose. It has to be informed by high quality design, and that process has to be responsibly managed. And that's a responsibility which falls onto our shoulders as a Department of Planning and our Development Applications Board, who ultimately are the decision makers. But it's also a responsibility on the development industry as well. And that's a point we've been making as we've been conducting stakeholder presentations throughout this entire consultation process. So climate change has quickly become the #1 issue for land use plans around the world. Bermuda has been experiencing increased extreme weather events. It's vulnerable to rising sea levels, being an island. And there have also been instances of coastal erosion in certain parts of the island as well. So it's of critical importance that climate change considerations are a factor in land use decisions, not just in Bermuda, but in any jurisdiction. So the consultative draft plan proposes the introduction of a strategic climate change policy into the plan, and that would require consideration of all relevant applications for developers to maximize the energy efficiency of their proposed development, explore the inclusion of renewables, include green infrastructure, not just from an amenity perspective, but also from a climate change adaptation point of view, ensure that flood risk is fully and appropriately managed within the development sites, and also advocates for incorporating forms of sustainable urban drainage. Another initiative which the plan introduces also under the banner of climate change is a requirement for energy statements. And that would be a requirement for a developer to go through a documented 3-stage process in order to demonstrate to the department that they had considered the energy needs of the final development through the entire process of coming up with their scheme. So as I mentioned, there are 3 stages to that. The first is in the overall design of the development, the materials and technologies that are going to be used within it, and also exploring the use of renewables to provide for the residual energy needs of the scheme. That we don't want this to be an overly onerous process. So the plan does contain additional details in terms of what we would expect to see within an energy statement in one of the appendices to the document. But through time, it's our intention to prepare a guidance note on this alongside colleagues in the Department of Energy. And ultimately where we see this going is a template being prepared So, and that would be a requirement for an applicant to fill in a simple form alongside their planning application. So districts and uses. The map on the right-hand side of the screen here splits the city up into different character areas. These are not zones and they're not intended to be overly restrictive or prescriptive in terms of the land use activities which would be permissible in different areas of the city. The plan defines something called city centre uses, and that's tied to the content of the recently approved use classes order. And what that says is that a broad range of uses would be considered acceptable throughout the city. The exception to that, and the only area where we think we need to retain tighter control on the activities taking place from a planning policy point of view, is within the retail core, and that's the area shown in red on the map. So this is broadly a continuation of an existing policy stance which seeks to protect that area first and foremost for shops. But we also recognise that that area has seen an increase in vacancy rates at the ground floor level, which is clearly concerning to us because this is a Bermuda's prime destination for in-person retailing. So we also want to ensure that the plan is supportive of a range of complementary uses which would increase footfall into that part of the city. So what the plan talks about is, in terms of other uses, is things like bars, restaurants, or financial services. Basically, what it is trying to target are those uses which have a clear public interface, which generate footfall throughout the business day, and the intention being that the existing businesses within the city would benefit from that passing trade, which those other uses would introduce into the area. The map also shows 4 strategic development sites, and that's the areas shown in yellow. So 3 of these sites have historically been included within previous development plans for the city, and it made sense to us to continue into this plan. So that's the City Hall car park site, Parleville car park site, and the waterfront area. And what the intention would be for the City Hall car park site and Parleville car park would be to prepare a design brief for those sites in collaboration with the corporation. Now, these wouldn't be overly prescriptive documents, but what they would do is identify the key design issues which have to be taken into account in formulating any proposals for those sites. Design statements can be, design briefs can be pretty useful tools to create better certainty as part of through the planning application process, because a developer looking at developing any of those sites will know that if they can broadly accord with the requirements of the design brief, then the planning application process can be much quicker and much more efficient. The waterfront area is treated slightly differently within the plan, firstly because it's a much larger area, but also because it's a more aesthetically sensitive part of the city as well. So what the plan requires for that area is a master plan for its comprehensive redevelopment, and the plan contains criteria which will require to be taken into account in devising any proposals for that area. So when we did our research on the city, we identified an overall ground floor vacancy rate of 15% across the city. The eastern end of Reed Street showed a ground floor vacancy rate of 28%. Which obviously was an indication of some form of economic strain in that part of the city. So we thought it would be worthwhile to include and highlight the existence of the former Canadian hotel site as a strategic development site in an effort to market the development of that site through the plan. The map also shows 4 areas of open space. So that's Victoria Park, Queen Elizabeth Park, Bars Bay Park, and All Boys Park. And there is a policy associated with those areas which seeks to tightly protect them for their open space and recreational value. So residential in the city, the plan is strongly supportive of additional residential development throughout the city above the ground floor level. And there are a couple of key reasons for that. First of all, having an increased residential population would provide support for existing city businesses, particularly those that are targeted at the evening and weekend economies. But also, if you have more people living within the city and they have access to existing services and facilities, there's less a requirement for them to travel to other parts of the island. So it also makes sense from a sustainability perspective. The plan proposes the removal of an existing requirement for communal areas of open space for new residential developments in the city, and instead suggests that a contribution towards the upgrade of an existing area of open space or other form of community benefit would be a better approach, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. An area where we do think there is continuing value is in respect of private open space. And when I mean private open space in the city, what we're primarily talking about is balconies. What we do hear from time to time from the development industry is that there should be no need to provide private open space in residential developments in the city because the spaces simply don't get used. And we did do quite a lot of research in this area, and what we find is that the spaces which aren't used are those which are not designed as an integral feature of the overall building. So the plan contains criteria which must be employed in designing those spaces, and we're confident if that does happen, then they will be valued and utilised. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Tamsin, who's going to go through the next few slides.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So parking. Hot topic of parking. We realize that this is a really complex issue, so a significant amount of research and data collection has gone into this particular topic. We also looked at other jurisdictions. So I would suggest, if you're interested in the topic of parking, really please go and take a look at the city survey report, because there's a lot of really interesting information in there which has been used to inform the policy direction that we've taken in the plan. Outright, we do want to say we do recognize that there is a need for parking. It's required to support a city. So we do acknowledge and support parking is needed in the city. But what we're trying to do is strike more of a balance. So right now, the City of Hamilton Plan 2015 essentially does not allow for parking in the restricted parking area. The restricted parking area in our current plan is generally the same area as the retail core. Outside of the restricted parking area, you can have parking, but it's limited to the operational minimum that is required to support the business. Residential developments outside of the restricted parking area, they would normally be required to have one car. The board does have the discretion, however, to approve less. And the issue with that is that TCD will ultimately always issue an assessment number, and that unit will be permitted a car, and it might not have on-site parking, which displaces it onto the city. We've also, the research that we put together, it's confirmed that about 12.5% of the landmass in the city is dedicated towards parking. We've looked at the public and the private parking lots across the city, and we've looked at their occupancy rates since 2016, and we just updated that data in the first quarter of this year. And essentially what we've come to understand is that generally most of them are not at full occupancy at the moment. We also looked at catchment analysis. So essentially we looked at the public parking lots and the private parking lots, and we looked at or we applied the standard 5-minute walking distance, which is used in most other jurisdictions, that somebody would be willing to walk from their car to their office. And we mapped spatially these catchment areas. And essentially what that showed us is that all parts of the city are within a 5-minute walking distance from a public or private parking lot. In the wrong locations, parking lots can be quite negative on streetscapes. They can take up valuable land, which could otherwise be used for enlivening or greening the city. And we have seen a trend recently in the department where buildings are being knocked down and turned into commercial parking lots, which can leave holes in the urban landscape that could otherwise maybe be used to accommodate new buildings. And the problem is that what we're finding is that once they're knocked down and turned into a parking lot, owners get quite accustomed to that steady flow of income and sort of minimal maintenance. And so we don't see those sites ever really getting redeveloped again. So under this particular plan, we have not really changed our stance in parking in the sense that previously the plan in the restricted parking area did not allow for any parking. So essentially that is the same area as what we're now calling the retail core. And that stance is remaining the same. Parking will not be permitted in the retail core. There will be a presumption against new parking outside of the retail core unless it is demonstrated through a parking study that existing parking facilities in the vicinity do not have the capacity to take on the needs that will be generated from the new development. So if that can be demonstrated that those nearby parking facilities cannot take on the parking needs, then the board has the discretion to allow for on-site parking, but generally the stance will be that we want you to use the existing facilities, which are not at full capacity. The plan supports the consolidation of parking to allow for more pedestrian space and alternative uses at key locations. With regards to residential parking, we will be requiring a maximum of 1 car parking space per residential unit, and this is for developments outside of the retail core. And the reason we're requiring that is we don't want to displace parking onto the city to manage. If there's instances where car parking cannot be provided, we would class those units as cycle-only units, and we would require cycle parking to be provided for on-site. The other thing that we are changing, obviously, we are very aware that, targets are moving towards electric vehicle sales only by 2035. And as such, we will be requiring the roughing in for electric vehicle charging points, but only for new residential developments, not for new commercial developments. Moving on to industrial. So the current city plan at the moment does not allow for any new heavy industrial development. Only light industrial development is permitted, but this is limited to minor extensions of existing light industrial operations only. So again, a lot of research went into looking at this topic. We went around and we looked at the industrial operations in the city. We looked at how they're impacting on the streets. We looked at how the footfall is in those areas. All of that information is outlined in the city survey report. Essentially what we noticed was unfortunately, they do create quite a number of adverse impacts on their immediate areas. Increased number of vehicular crossings across the sidewalk, inappropriate frontages with roller doors, noise, unpleasant odors. And ultimately, they also tend to cluster together in the city. So then you end up having this cumulative impact where parts of the city become sort of a bit of a dead zone, and there's not a lot of footfall that's generated in these areas. So essentially, this plan takes it a step further. It takes more of a firmer stance. So it does not allow for any new industrial development, whether that be heavy or expansion of existing light industrial facilities. It does not hinder existing facilities from continuing to operate, but it will not allow for new industrial developments. It won't hinder circumstances where if you have a non-industrial use that wants to do, say, a storage addition, and storage is usually considered a form of light industrial use. So if you need to do a storage addition that is associated with an existing non-industrial operation, we would consider that an accessory use. So it wouldn't hinder those types of proposals. Moving on to development viability. So in other jurisdictions around the world, developer contributions are firmly established policies, which essentially, for example, if you're going to do a new development with a few hundred residential buildings or houses, you might be expected to contribute or build a new school to support that because of the impact that it's going to have. We do not think that degree of contribution is going to work here. We do think that a scaled down version of this, however, would be appropriate for the city of Hamilton. So for example, maybe a development contribution might be the installation of play equipment in one of the public parks. So a range of contributions is going to be identified, and that's going to be done with the Corporation of Hamilton. And the scale will essentially will depend on the development proposal and the impact that it's going to have. So there'll be a range. And we are going to be putting together a guidance note, which will be put together with the corporation, which will essentially set out the process and how that will all work. We do recognize that the type of development viability developer contribution could potentially impact on the overall viability of a project. So if that is raised as an issue, we would require something called a development viability statement, which essentially would be letting us know sort of how it would be impacting it to a point that it would completely throw the viability of the project off. While they can be complicated statements, essentially, we're quite convinced that developers have a pretty firm understanding of their projected returns early on in the process, and we're just asking them to demonstrate that to us. But the whole idea is that every development that would go up there would be something that would improve the quality of the public environment for the best interest of the city, but also so that the community and the people using the city can have more enjoyment in these spaces. And in terms of the timeline, so right now we are March, and our public consultation for the consultative draft will be ending soon on the 24th of March. After that, we're going to be reviewing all of the feedback that we have received, and we'll be refining the plan and updating the city survey. We're hoping to issue a draft plan in sort of June time, which again will be the second public consultation phase of this process, where members of the public will be able to review and give us feedback. And essentially by August that should be done, and we'll look at those objections and put together departmental position reports, with the idea that in January we would start sort of presenting any objections that could not be resolved between the department and the objector would be presented to a tribunal, who would prepare a report that would go to the minister, who would essentially make his decisions. And the whole idea is that by July 2024, it would be taken to cabinet, so that around September time 2024, it would be adopted. And then last slide is to do with a placemaking competition. So essentially, we thought it would be sort of fun with this new overarching concept in the plan, which Kenny's spoken about. We thought it would be fun to have a placemaking design competition, just to stimulate some public interest in the topic. So essentially, you would pick one or more of the strategic development sites, and you would put together a conceptual design that looks at context, but also looks at the 6 core placemaking principles that are identified in the plan. It's not going to inform development of the sites. This is just a fun exercise that we thought would sort of stimulate some interest in the subject. There'll be a winner that will be chosen for each site, and we are inviting all. So we've even sent it to the schools. Everybody can take part. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Kenny.
Thank you, Tamsin. Yeah, we're trying to make it as easy as possible through this process for people to provide us with feedback. So we're simply asking that you provide us with an email with any thoughts and comments that you have. And the email address is on the screen at the moment, which is cityplan@gov.bm. Alternatively, people can go onto our website, which is planning.gov.bm, and click on the link through to the consultative draft plan page. On there is a story map version of the plan, and there is a questionnaire embedded within that, which asks, I think it's 8 questions in total. So that's designed to try and get feedback on key policy issues. So please feel free to go on and utilize that as well. With that said, that's the end of our presentation. And once again, just want to thank everyone for joining us. So I'm just going to hand it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Kenny and Timden, for your presentations. So we will now enter the question phase of this presentation here. I want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions in Facebook right below the video that you see there, or you can email them to askus@gov.bm. So Kenny and Tenzin, the first question that we have is, does the plan require that development proposals consider disabled access?
Yeah, I can take on that one. Absolutely, yeah. We do have a policy. It's actually under the placemaking. One of the core placemaking principles is easy to move around, connected. And essentially what that requires is that any development proposal that is submitted to our department, we have to take a real good look at access arrangements to ensure that we're accommodating people with a range of physical abilities, which would include any type of disabled access and wheelchair access.
Okay. Next question is, can you provide examples of the sorts of projects which would constitute a community benefit?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Well, first and foremost, the scale of any community benefit would have to relate directly to the scale of the development and the nature of the development being proposed. So that's the first thing that we would have to take into account. And as Tamsin mentioned during the presentation, we would be preparing a guidance note on that to provide greater certainty for the community benefit process. But, and also as Tamsin mentioned, I don't think that we can have too hard-lined of a position on this, and I think we have to slowly try and implement this policy initiative. So, the sorts of things that I had in my mind for community benefit would be, as Tamsin mentioned, like a contribution towards the upgrade of an area of open space, perhaps the installation of some play equipment or upgrades to the immediate pedestrian environment. That could be like tree planting, that sort of thing. So that's the sort of scale that we have in our minds at the moment in terms of the level that we would be targeting that initiative at.
Okay, kind of to make it more green.
Yeah, well, that is one part of it. Yeah.
Mhm.
And obviously, just on that, Michael, I mean, all of these things would require collaboration with the corporation, because most of what we're talking about is public land, and we're having dialogue with the corporation about exactly how we would go about implementing a policy of this nature. But I do think it does have value, and it can assist in enhancing the city's environment.
Yep, certainly. Okay, the next question that we have here is, does the plan set out proposals for the redevelopment, if any, of the strategic development sites?
I can take on this one. So the plan doesn't specifically set out proposals for redevelopment of those sites, but what it does do is it requires that in the case of the City Hall car park, Parleville car park, and the former Canadian Hotel, it requires that design briefs be prepared in collaboration. Well, we would be collaborating with the corporation on that, or the owners in the case of the former Canadian Hotel site, the owners of those sites, that essentially set out sort of the vision for those sites and what we're gonna sort of wanna see. The waterfront's a little bit different. That actually, the provisions require a master plan. It's, as Kenny has mentioned, it's a much larger site that requires a different level of consideration. So it doesn't specifically set out proposals, but under each of those sites, the plan does identify criteria which must be met in putting together design briefs or master plans for those sites.
Yeah, just on the back of that as well, Tamsin, I think it's important to add that, you know, it would be pretty meaningless for a planning document to say specifically what's going to happen on any of those sites if there is no interest in the development sector of pursuing whatever we say should be acceptable. So it really has to be flexible, and that would be, as I mentioned earlier on, the intent of both a design brief for the Parleville and City Hall car park sites and a master plan for the waterfront area. What is important from a planning policy perspective is to identify the key issues associated with each of those sites and give an indication of how they could be addressed in preparing design solutions for those locations.
All right, next question that we have, how many vacant buildings are there in the city of Hamilton?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I actually have that offhand. It's in the city survey. Let me see if I can find that. Maybe we can move on to
Sure.
another question, and I'll just see if I can find that information in my report.
Okay. So the next question that we have is, what are the core placemaking principles which are relevant to this plan?
Yeah, I can take that one on actually. As well. Okay, so there's actually, the plan identifies 6 placemaking principles. The first one is distinctive. So we want design proposals to consider the context specifically. So looking within the area, looking at the height, the scale, the massing, the sort of established building line of the area. We want them to respond positively to any sort of features in the area. We also, the next placemaking principle is designing proposals that are safe and pleasant. So that's all to do with sort of active frontages that attract footfall, you know, windows that look onto illuminated streets and walkways that allow for that sort of natural surveillance of these spaces. Avoiding the creation of blind corners and recesses as you're walking around the city. The next principle is connected, easy to move around and beyond. And essentially that is all to do with connectivity. And this is where that point comes into where access arrangements need to consider a range of people with physical abilities. I think we talked about that. It was probably one of the first questions that was asked. The next principle is the idea of creating welcoming spaces that really pull people in. So, you know, incorporating public art, things that are interesting features, street furniture that allow people to want to use the space, maybe creative artistic installations. We also want people to look at adaptability. So that's another principle. So allowing that, just considering future users, age, the degree of personal mobility, all of those things, so that a space can easily be adapted to adapt to new uses that may move in and out of a building. And then last but not least, sustainable and resource efficient developments. We really need people to take, I think there has to be a movement towards this. So this is looking a little bit further, but orientation of buildings, incorporating plantings that will sort of support natural heating, shading and cooling of buildings, integration of renewable and low carbon technologies. And obviously we're supporting the adaptive reuse of buildings because that's more sustainable as well. So I think that covers all of the core principles.
So another question that we have coming up, and Timden, this there's another bit related to the vacant buildings, and that is what is being done to encourage their use and development as well. But I'll come back to those. But another question we have is what research has been done in preparing for this plan?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Whilst Tamsin's researching. Yeah, as I mentioned during the presentation, we've prepared the city survey report for 2023, and that contains a whole raft of information associated with each of the policy areas set out within the plan. I think that document's around 160 pages, so there's a lot of information in there. And as I said earlier on, we want to ensure that the data that we gathered and how we've analysed it directly relates to the content of the plan, so that there's a strong evidence base for the decisions that we've set out within the plan. But I think it's important to note, and this isn't included within the city survey report, is that we didn't just look at what's happening locally. We looked closely at how other jurisdictions are dealing with similar issues which the city of Hamilton has been experiencing, and that has informed a lot of the policy approaches that we have set out within the plan. And that was a real significant part of our own research in preparing the document.
Okay.
So
all right, I just want to
go on, sorry.
I was just going to remind everyone about submitting their questions. Thank you for those that have sent them in thus far. But again, you can pop them right into the chat on the Facebook page, or you can email them to askus@gov.bm. So go ahead, Timden.
Yeah, so I think it's important to make a decision between vacant buildings that are essentially classed as sort of uninhabitable or unusable, and unoccupied spaces, which are still able to be used, they're just not occupied. You know, they're maybe looking for a tenant, right?
Certainly.
So, I mean, just looking in the city survey, and again, the data that we had was from 2021, the most recent data, and this was essentially taken from the Department of Land Valuation as well as field survey work. There is a total of 12 uninhabitable buildings and 2 unusable buildings. So the uninhabitable buildings would be residential, and the unusable buildings would be non-residential. And again, you can look at this information. If you go into the survey, there's actually a map that shows you where they're all located. So I don't have the addresses handy, but the map will show you where they are. And then I look at the unoccupied buildings, which are buildings that are essentially available and usable. I'm just trying to see if I have a total of 70 buildings in the city were unoccupied but capable of being used. All right.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and the next part was what is being done to encourage their use and development.
Well, that's the whole point of this plan, and particularly in terms of the decision-making process set out within it. As I mentioned earlier on, we want to try and move away from those policies which mandate the refusal of a planning application and implement a much more flexible system, which would allow people to come up with much more varied designs within the city, both in terms of the scale of development that would be allowed and in some instances the uses that would take place within those buildings. So this plan does implement a much more flexible framework for the private sector to respond to that in a wide range of circumstances. And that's what we're trying to achieve within this plan. But I think it's also important to know that we do have a battle on our hands, particularly in terms of those vacancies that Tamsin just mentioned. we all know that as a consequence of working from home strategies, that offices in particular are being hit by those vacancy rates. So this isn't just a ground floor issue, obviously. And again, that's something that's happening around the world. So from our perspective, it's really important to have a flexible document in place to ensure that we could be responding proactively to a wide range of proposals in those sites which do become vacant. But from our perspective, there is obviously a limitation of a land use plan. I mean, we can only put the policies in place as more of a facilitatory role rather than actually going out and seeking investment. So that's our role in the process, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to develop appropriately within the city under this plan.
All right, thank you, Kenny. So on to the next question we have is, does the plan propose or support pedestrianization of any specific areas of the city?
I can take that one on. So the plan doesn't propose pedestrianization. I mean, the pedestrianization of specific streets, that actually falls under the remit of the corporation, but it does support pedestrianization. Obviously, the whole plan is trying to encourage the movement of people over the movement of motor vehicles. And obviously any proposals put forth by the corporation to pedestrianize specific streets, that's something that sort of the plan complements for sure. Yeah.
All right, just checking to see if we have any more questions coming in. And I think that was actually the last one. So Kenny and Tendon, I hand it back to you if you have anything further to add.
All right, thank you, Michael. Yeah, just to finish by saying thank you again for joining us today. As I mentioned during the presentation, it is really important that we hear feedback from people, because that's what will shape the plan from this point onwards. Our email address is cityplan@gov.bm, and if you want to find more information about the plan, you can go onto our website, planning.gov.bm. We're happy to hear any ideas, any thoughts people may have on the city plan. And as Tamsin had said during the presentation, the consultation on this plan and this version of the document ends on the 24th of March, which I believe is next Friday.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bermuda. That's it. That is the end of this Lunch and Learn. Hope you learned lots. And again, as Kenny said, and Tim, then if you have any further questions, do not hesitate to submit them and contribute toward the final plan. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day, Bermuda. Bye-bye.